I think that wherever you go in the world today, and I think this has always been the case, there are two experiences that people have that are universally exhilarating. That no matter where you go, and no matter who you speak to throughout the world, people will tell you that one of the things they love most to do is to travel, is to go to a very faraway place, especially a place that's very exotic, and they will plan for these kind of trips, and they'll really look forward to an experience where they get to go away to some place very exotic and very distant, and they'll talk about it for weeks and months afterwards, because it's such an incredible thing to do, to go on a journey and to take a trip to a faraway place that we've never been to before. It's such an exciting adventure. It's one of the things people do in life that they really look forward to. People don't want to spend 52 weeks out of the year working, and so when they think about what we're going to do when we're not working, traveling is one of the most common experiences people all look forward to. No matter who we are, no matter where we live, no matter what culture, no matter what country, somehow people get a tremendous charge out of traveling. But incredibly, I think, no matter how much pleasure and enjoyment we get out of traveling, I think the other side of the story is sometimes even more pleasurable. Meaning, after a long journey away from home, the time that we come back to our homes, come back to our own bed, come back to a place where you could find your way around at night without the lights on, it's very familiar, it's just, you feel that this is your place, and it feels so wonderful to be coming home. These two experiences, I think we all can relate to. The incredible pleasure of traveling, and almost the more pleasurable experience of finally coming back home. No matter how great that trip was, is it nice to be back in my own place. Now the mystics, the Jewish mystics, teach us that the reason everyone relates so strongly to these experiences is that these experiences of traveling and of returning home, they express a deeper reality. They express something that's really deeper than simply going on a trip to another country. The mystics explain that in truth, all of us come from a place that's very, very far away. Every single human being originated in a world that was very, very different. Our soul comes from a realm of existence that's purely spiritual. Our souls are not from this world. Our souls come from very, very far away. And our soul comes into this world, into this physical, terrestrial existence, and our soul puts on an earth suit. Our soul puts on a physical body, right? And for 70 years, 80 years, 90 years, 120 years, we live this journey. All of us are basically here on an incredible journey. And our lives are exciting. We experience new things, we meet people, we go to places that are exciting, and we live our lives. Hopefully, our lives should be exciting. Our lives should be experiences where we're learning, we're experiencing, we're growing. And so life can be an incredible journey. And yet the mystics teach us that no matter how incredible this life is, our souls ultimately yearn to go back to where they came from. Meaning our soul is not 100% comfortable in a physical reality. Our soul comes from a spiritual realm. So the soul is having an incredible time in this body, in this world, yet the soul really seeks and yearns to go back to a more familiar kind of turf. So the fact that we all relate strongly to and we can identify with the joy and the pleasure of traveling and coming home is because all of us are really doing that. All of us are here on this trip, on this journey, and all of us will be going home at some point. And those are incredible experiences, and they really speak on two different levels. Now what's interesting is that not only is each of our personal stories a story of journeying and going on a journey, but as a Jewish people, as a nation, our national story begins with a journey. Abraham grows up in Ur Kasdim, and God says to him, now get going. Lech lecha. You're really going to yourself. Ultimately, this is not just a physical journey to another place. Ultimately, when we journey to become our true selves. So it's not just going somewhere, it's really a personal journey of development, of personal growth. And so our national story begins with our nation, at least the seed of our nation, Abraham and Sarah and their small family that will grow into the Jewish people, are told to go on a journey, to go on this trip. But incredibly, as soon as they get to Israel, just about as soon as they arrive at their destination, what happens? They're forced to leave Israel and to go down to Egypt because there's a famine in Canaan. There's a famine in Israel. And so Abraham and his family have to go down to Egypt. And this exact same story is echoed later on when Abraham's great-grandchildren have to again, the children of Jacob, have to again go down to Egypt. They have to leave Israel because there's a famine in Israel, and they have to go down to Egypt in search of food. And now again, are people experiencing the same thing? That people today are leaving Israel again because they are hungry and they're thirsty. It's going on today. Jewish people leaving our homeland in search of nourishment. But it's not a physical hunger, and it's not a physical thirst. The prophet Amos, in his 8th chapter, famously predicted, there's going to come a time, the prophet said, when God's going to send a famine to the world. And the prophet says it's not going to be a hunger for food, it's not going to be a thirst for water, it's going to be a hunger and a thirst for spirituality and for closeness to God. And so today, we're experiencing that same dynamic that we experienced in the early days of our history, of our people, where we're in our homeland, and yet people are leaving Israel because they're spiritually hungry. It's estimated today that about a half of all of the Israeli young people who just finished their national service in the army, after that period of service in the army, about half of them go for extended trips to the Far East, traveling around India and Nepal and Thailand, all throughout the Far East, and experiencing incredibly different things than they would experience in Israel. And many of them tasting the spiritual offerings of the Far East. What's interesting is that not only are our Israeli brothers and sisters searching throughout the world for spirituality, we find the same thing among Jews in North America. The estimates are that in North America, about 25 to 30% of North Americans who practice Buddhism come from a Jewish background. Way, way out of proportion to our numbers. If you poke around today at some of the most popular Buddhist journals and the teachers of Buddhism throughout North America, you'll find that many, many, many of the teachers and the writers and the thinkers and the movers and the shakers are people who grew up as Jews. Go to any bookstore today in North America, you'll find many books by someone named Lama Suryadas. Lama Suryadas grew up as Jeffrey Miller in Long Island, maybe 50 or 60 years ago. one of the most famous and popular forms of meditation in North America, in the West, is called Vipassana. Came from India, and it was brought to North America by 4 Jews. There was, interestingly, at the end of the 1900s, I believe, there was a huge fair. I guess it was like a World's Fair. I forget what they called it, in Chicago, I believe. And it was one of the first times where North Americans were exposed to teachers from India. And they say that in the late 1800s, or late 1900s, the first North American convert to Buddhism was a Jewish fellow named Strauss, the very first North American. But ever since that time, there's been an incredible interest that Jews have in the teachings of Buddhism. And not just Buddhism. One of the most famous teachers today in the world of Hinduism is Baba Ramdas. Baba Ramdas grew up as Richard Alpert, Jewish fellow. And I remember when I came here to Toronto 20 years ago, I worked as the chaplain at the University of Toronto, the Jewish chaplain, and I was invited one day by the Hindu chaplain to speak at his Hindu temple downtown Toronto. And I remember going to this Hindu temple on a Sunday morning down on Emmett Avenue, and I walked in. I had assumed that maybe I would go there and there'd be 1 or 2 Jews. I figured that's why I'll go. Maybe there'll be 1 or 2 Jews there. And I remember walking into this Hindu temple and totally blown away that the place was crawling with Jews. Crawling with Jews. So we have today Jews that are so deeply involved in Buddhism, in Hinduism. In Toronto here, we have the leading Sikh teacher in this part of Canada, whose name is Harinam Singh Khalsa. Harinam Singh Khalsa grew up in the Kensington Market section downtown, maybe 63, 64 years ago. His name was David Friedman. I went to a Sufi gathering a few years ago in Mississauga. Sufis are the mystical Muslims. These were the whirling dervishes. And the leader of the Sufi group that I was visiting in Mississauga is a Jewish Holocaust survivor, right here in Toronto. So we have so many of our people that are somehow connecting and seeking and finding spiritual nourishment in all of these foreign pastures. What's interesting is that if you wanted to find the largest Passover Seder in the world today, you won't find it in New York, you won't find it anywhere in Israel. The largest Passover Seder in the world today takes place every year in Kathmandu, Nepal. And usually about 1,000, 1,200, primarily Israelis, gather in Kathmandu for this huge, humongous Seder. And so the story that I will tell tonight begins in 1997, when a young man from here in Toronto, Azriel Cohen, went to this Seder in Kathmandu. He was very curious, what is going on with all of these Jews, and especially Israelis? Why are they so interested in Eastern religions? So Azriel went to this Seder, and he interviewed many people, and one of the things they told him was that if you're interested in finding out more about Jews and Eastern religions, you've got to go to Dharamsala. Dharamsala is a small little hill station in northern India at the foothill of the Himalaya mountains, and it's where the Dalai Lama settled after he left Tibet. In the 1960s, he walked all the way by foot from Tibet to India. The Indian government was nice enough to give him this little town for a community to build, and it's become the world headquarters of Tibetan Buddhism. And the Dalai Lama gives teachings, public teachings, every spring there. And so Azriel was told, if you want to really meet lots of Jews who are into Buddhism, go to Dharamsala, and you'll find an incredible number of people to speak to. And he did that. And he went to Dharamsala, and he met with hundreds of Israelis there, and he asked many questions. And he met in Dharamsala 4 Americans that had moved there and opened up a restaurant called Kana Nirvana. And they were there basically doing humanitarian work, but 2 of these 4 were Jewish. And he developed a relationship with them, and he decided that he would go back in the fall to Dharamsala to build a sukkah on the roof of this Kana Nirvana restaurant. And he had also there hundreds of Israelis came to the sukkah, and he was meeting more and more and more Israelis that were dabbling in Eastern religions. And he ended up meeting with the Dalai Lama. and with these 4 Americans. And they did a lot of speaking about the problem of Israeli secular religious tensions. Azriel was very interested in how do we bridge the incredible gap that seems to be building in Israel between religious Jews and secular Jews. And so he spoke for a long time with the Dalai Lama about tolerance. When Azriel came back to North America, he was a photographer. He took many, many photographs of his trip to the Far East. And what he did was he went on a speaking tour throughout North America with 2 of the Americans from that restaurant. And one of the stops on his speaking tour was here in Toronto. He spoke down at the JCC on Bloor Street. And he showed these amazing slides of his trip to India, of Dharamsala. And my wife and I were in the audience. My wife gives me a tremendous shot in the ribs with her elbow and says, "Boy, wouldn't it be amazing if we could go there?" And I sort of yawned and said, "You're right. We're going to be going there." I thought it was like a strange thing to say. Anyway, we met Azriel after the program, became friendly with him, and he asked me if we could do a program together at the JCC a few weeks later on the topic of tolerance. And it would be exploring tolerance from a Jewish perspective and from a Buddhist perspective. I was going to present the Jewish perspective, or a Jewish perspective on the topic of tolerance, and he was going to share some of the teachings he learned from the Dalai Lama. We did this program at the Bloor JCC. About 100 people showed up. Some of them were Jews who were going to be going the next day to Dharamsala, India, to get ordained as Buddhist monks, basically. And it was an amazing program. There was a tremendous amount of interest in what we were sharing. Over the following weeks, we became a little bit more friendly with Azriel, and he told us he was going to be going to India for Passover again. And he asked us, "Would you be interested in coming?" And this was about 3 weeks before Passover. And I said to him, "We'd be there in a heartbeat." So we had to quickly get our shots and get prepared. And we ended up landing in India about, I think, 3 days before Passover. Azriel got there a week before Passover, and he was getting ready. He had to, for example, start making raisin wine. You can't buy kosher wine in India. So he started soaking tons of raisins and getting the raisin wine ready, and other preparations. And my wife and I showed up, I think, on a Wednesday in India. That year, Passover's first night was Friday night. So I believe that Thursday morning, we ended up getting a cab from from New Delhi to Dharamsala. It took about 17 hours. That was a very, very huge experience that I could talk about maybe later tonight. But about a 17-hour cab ride from New Delhi up to Dharamsala, driving around these treacherous mountain roads where there's no guardrail, there's no lights, there's nothing stopping you from plummeting down. I mean, the roads were this thin. It was terrifying. We get to, I believe, Dharamsala Thursday, late night. Friday morning, we start looking for a place for the Seders. And I might be a day off in my recounting this. The first place we found was an abandoned school, or a school that wasn't being used, that had a little goat tied up outside the school. And we said, "That's amazing," because before Passover, the Jews had to tie up their goats right before the Passover animal was sacrificed. And we said, "This is really cool that they have an animal tied up right outside the school." But you have to appreciate Dharamsala is a town with 3 streets with running sewage going through it. There are no street lights, and this school would have been impossible to find because it was down in this little valley. There were no lights. People wouldn't be able to get there, so we didn't go with that possibility. We then found this hotel, like a 2-star hotel or a 1-star hotel, called the Surya House. And the Surya House probably was built by the British in about 1910 or something, and they had a downstairs basement that probably was never used in 60, 70 years. It was full of dust, and it had broken out windows. If you can picture, this room was about the size of this sanctuary. And there was a whole bank of windows along one wall that was overlooking the Kangra Valley, an incredible view of this amazing valley. And we were getting ready for this Seder. And our problem was we didn't know really who was going to show up to the Seder. We knew there were hundreds of Israelis around. We tried to put up some signs, but we had no idea really who's going to be coming and how we're going to run this Seder, what's going to be happening. So we had some volunteers that emerged to start cooking some food. You can imagine the food is very simple, basically just some fruits and vegetables. One fellow came in from Israel with a couple of crates full of matzahs. Thank God we had matzah. We had the raisin wine ready. And we wanted to make sure that everyone would feel welcome and comfortable at the Seder. We knew we'd have mainly Israelis. We knew we were going to have some Western travelers. We knew there'd be some Tibetans that were there. So one thing that we did was we translated a big welcome sign in Hebrew, English, Hindi, and Tibetan. We wanted to make a statement that at our Seder, everyone is going to be welcome. We then took all of the raisin wine and we divided it up into 4, you can imagine these big plastic garbage pails, these big, huge things that people will throw their garbage in. We put the raisin wine into these 4 big garbage pails, and we labeled each garbage pail one of the 4 languages of redemption. The rabbis teach us that when the Jews were coming out of Egypt, the Bible speaks about 4 different expressions the Bible uses that God took us out, and God redeemed us, and God saved us. So we took these 4 Hebrew words, and we put them on these containers in Hebrew, in English, and I sat with one of the Tibetans for 3 hours trying to come up with the proper Tibetan word that would somehow capture these Hebrew words. And then I had to come up with the proper English word, and then we got a Hindi translation. So we had the 4 basically containers for our wine, again, Hebrew, English, Tibetan, and Hindi. Some of the girls from Israel made an ark for the Torah. We carried from Toronto a Torah scroll that Beth Yehuda congregation lent us. I carried it all the way to India, a little Torah scroll, and they made a few of the girls a little box to hold this beautiful Torah. And we didn't have any electricity in the room. So to make sure we'd have light, we had, thank God, the full moon coming in from these windows. But we purchased these tremendously large candles that they were giving us some light. And there was no chairs and no furniture in this room. Again, it was a bombed out shelter practically. So we cleaned up the room and we bought these huge mats. And the way the room was set up was in the center, my wife had painted on the top of a lid a psychedelic Seder plate. So we had this Seder plate sitting on the top of a broken piece of pot, a big jar, an earthenware jar that held the Seder plate. And coming out from the center point of the room were all of these mats coming out like spokes of a wheel. We begin the Seder, and lo and behold, there were about 200 people that show up in this room. And again, the question is, what are we going to do with them? How are we going to somehow make a Seder accessible to all these different people? Most of them had probably never been to a real Passover Seder. The ones that had been to a Passover Seder probably had been to a half-hour, 45-minute family meal. We probably had some people who had never been to a Seder. We had Tibetans there. So we dispensed with the Haggadah. We didn't use the Passover Haggadah. And we basically explained the core ideas of the Passover Seder, again, in 3 languages. Everything was explained in Hebrew, in English, in Tibetan. At one point, we held up the Torah, and we read in Hebrew the story of the Jews leaving Egypt. We then read the same story in English, and then we had it translated into Tibetan. Everything that we did was explained in all 3 languages, and then we wanted people to have a chance to talk about their own personal journeys, because this was not just an evening of what happened 3,000 years ago. Everyone in this room was on a journey. Everyone in this room was seeking personal liberation. So at some point during the evening, we broke up into these groups of 20, 25 people sitting around on these mats, and people discussed why they were in India, what were they looking for. We had one of the Tibetans who had been tortured for 2.5 years in a Chinese prison, tortured for being Tibetan, spoke about maror, spoke about bitterness, the bitterness of being in exile. The Seder lasted 8.5 hours. 8.5 hours sitting on the floor, no chairs, eating basically some matzah, some vegetable soup, a fruit salad. That was all we really had. And at the end, I remember so many of the Israelis got up and they basically screamed, "Zahaya mashu magic!" This was a magical experience for them. They were totally blown away by this magical Seder. I want to share with you just a few of the reactions. What we ended up doing that week was, after the Seders, we ran every day classes, discussion groups on the roof of the Kana Nirvana restaurant, and people came and we discussed things like reincarnation and vegetarianism. We had many, many classes and discussion groups. So we had many people who came to these programs, and this is some of the reaction. A fellow named Dave, who'd been originally from Colorado, wrote the following. "For the first time in my life, I've discovered people who are willing to and can answer my questions. With these new friends, I've begun to find the courage to face my anger." One of the themes that kept on coming up were that so many of the Jewish people that we met were angry about how they grew up Jewishly. They were either angry about how meaningless it was, or they were angry about how it was imposed upon them. But for some reason, many of the people that we met had a lot of anger they were dealing with. And Dave says, I finally found the courage to face my anger and begin the exploration of Judaism that I've quietly wished for so many years. Shira, who grew up in Jerusalem, wrote, "These weeks possess so much power, enough to transport me from the mundane world to a spiritual one, to pierce my soul, arouse my emotions, bringing those tears pouring, making me know that I have come back home. Thank you all so very much." And finally, Dara from California wrote, "I give thanks to this community in Dharam Sala for giving me and so many a place to heal from a life of doubt. I never thought that I would want to embrace my own faith, to make peace with my own people. I always wanted to run away from the pain in our big family. Now, I want to move straight back in. I'll never forget the joy that I've gotten to be part of. Thank you so very much." What was amazing to us were that so many of these Jewish people who never, ever, ever connected with Judaism, in this magical week, found so much that they were attracted to in their own faith. How do we understand this incredible flight from Judaism? How do we explain the fact that today so many Jewish people are seeking spirituality elsewhere? In Hinduism, in Buddhism, in Sikhism, in Sufism, in Christianity. We have so many Jewish people today that are filling ashrams. And we all know that if you show up at an average synagogue in North America on a Shabbat, if there's no bar mitzvah going on, it's not going to be full. Why is that happening? I tell a story about someone who had a job at a railroad crossing. And he had a very important job, because when a car was coming in one direction, if the train was coming in another direction, he had to make sure the car knew a train was coming. One night, he hears the blasting horn of the train coming, and he sees the headlights of a car. He goes into his booth, takes out his lantern, he waves it back and forth. The car's not slowing down, and he's getting very nervous. He starts waving the lantern faster and faster. The car does not slow down. The car goes right through the intersection. The train basically squashes this car. The motorist is killed instantly, and there's a big trial. The family of the motorist sues the train company for $16 million. At the trial, the star witness for the train company is the signalman. They ask him from the stand, "Were you there that night?" "Yes, I was there." "What happened?" "I heard the train coming. I saw the car coming. I took my lantern. I waved it back and forth. The guy didn't stop." On the basis of his testimony, the train company is acquitted. They win the trial. They don't have to pay any money to the family. The president of the company is overjoyed, and he goes over to thank this signalman who'd given this testimony. The man is sitting in the chair, and he's weeping. He can't even control himself. He can't catch his breath. And the president wants to go over and shake his hand and say thank you. And the president says, what's wrong? Why are you so upset? And the man says to the president, "You know, sir, I don't really know what I would have said had anyone bothered asking me, was your lantern lit?" When we try to understand why is it that so many Jewish people today are seeking spiritual nourishment in foreign pastures, we have to ask ourselves, what is it that they're not really getting from the Judaism that they're exposed to? The rabbis teach an amazing thing in the Talmud. The rabbis teach in the Talmud several different places, Achbara lo ganva, chura ganva. The mouse is not the thief. It's the hole in the wall that no one repaired, that's the thief. The rabbis are teaching us that you shouldn't ever get angry with the mouse for taking the cheese. The mouse is not the thief. You can't get angry at the mouse. That's what mice do. They eat cheese. If you want to get angry with the person who never fixed the hole in the wall. That's the problem. And so when we look at all these Jewish people today who are in ashrams, who are in meditation centers, who are in yoga centers, who are in Sufi centers, who are in every center in the world, but they're not in our shuls with us, we can't get angry with them. You know, there's a famous song by the Police. It's actually an old expression. A song by the Police is called "A Canary in a Coal Mine." Right? But we all know that one of the ways that they would be able to tell whether the coal mine was safe to go into was they would send a little bird down. Because if the bird was able to breathe the air in that coal mine, the bird's constitution is not as strong as a human being. So all the more so, a human being could go down into that shaft. If the bird's going to drop dead, you don't want to send any people down there. So when we think about our Jewish world today, you know, we have Jews that are probably the most spiritually sensitive. The most spiritually sensitive. Often, the rest of us have a high tolerance for some of the mediocrity that goes on in our Jewish world. We have a very high tolerance for a lot of the mediocrity that is passing for what's normal in our Jewish world. Somehow, many of us are able to go to synagogues where we're really, if we were to be asked honestly, do you find this compelling? Do you find this spiritual? Do you find this exciting? If we were honest, we'd say, you know, it's actually quite boring here. It doesn't excite me at all. Why are you going? That's what we do, we go. But there are many of our community that have a more maybe delicate spiritual constitution, and they can't tolerate a lot of what passes in the Jewish world. They can't tolerate it. You know, years ago, I often tell this story, about 100 years ago, there was a very sensitive Jewish soul in Germany who really was not impressed with Judaism. He decided he was going to convert to Christianity. And Franz Rosenzweig one night was about to get baptized, and he said on the way to his baptism, you know what, I'm going to give Judaism one last shot, one last kick at the can. And he happened to just go into a synagogue in Germany one night before his baptism, and his mazel, it was Kol Nidre night. It was the evening of Yom Kippur, Kol Nidre, and he must have encountered something magical and something profound and something deep and something moving and something spiritual in that shtibel he walked into in Germany. Because he came out of that synagogue resolving not to convert to Christianity, resolving to explore Judaism for the rest of his life. And Franz Rosenzweig became one of the most famous Jewish philosophers in the past 200 years. But I often ask myself, what would happen today, 2012 in Toronto, Canada, or if you went to Vancouver, British Columbia, or you went to any city in the United States, and a young Jew in their 20s was thinking of converting to another religion and said, you know what, I want to give Judaism one last try. And they walked into any shul at random, pick a shul out of the phone book on a Saturday morning, pop into the shul, what would they experience there? Would they experience something so profound and so deep and so meaningful and so powerful that they would never even think about converting? Or would their experience confirm their decision to go and convert to another religion? There are so many things that our Jewish world seems to be missing. During the Holocaust, one of the holiest Hasidic Rebbes was the Piasetzner Rebbe. He was actually the last Hasidic Rebbe to be functioning as a Rebbe during the Shoah, during the Holocaust. And he was in the Warsaw Ghetto, and he preached, he gave sermons during the time when the Jews were being decimated during that period of time in history. He saw some of the people in his own family dying in the bombing of Warsaw. And he published these sermons. And he knew that they're not going to see the light of day. So he buried these sermons under the floor of the Warsaw Ghetto with a note saying if these sermons are ever found, they should be sent to, he's got a relative in Israel somewhere, and he should take care of them. And that's what happened. The Kachava, in the 1960s, I believe, they were found by a Polish worker that was doing work under the floor of the Warsaw Ghetto. The documents were sent to Israel and published. And today we have books that are called the Eish Kodesh, the Holy Fire. That's what this Rebbe is called. The Piasetzner Rebbe, the Eish Kodesh. One of his books is called Sav V'Ziruz, translated recently into English by Rabbi Starrett. And he writes the following. He says, the soul of each person loves to feel. Our souls love to feel things. He says our souls yearn not only for feelings of happiness, our souls want so much to have feelings and to feel things that they're not only going to be happy with feeling things that are happy. Our souls will even long for melancholy and tearful feelings, meaning that we even want to be upset, even things that bother us. The soul wants to feel, whether it's happy or it's sad, whether it's depressing or it's something that really makes us jump for joy, but our souls need to feel. He says a person, he never saw a hockey game, or he never saw people rubbernecking at a traffic accident. He doesn't know yet what he's talking about, but he says a person will listen to horror stories, right? They'll even listen to scary stories, or watch violent, horrifying scenes, which can bring him to tears, just so he'll be able to feel. We need to feel. He says emotion is the food of the soul. It is as much of a need of the soul as food is to the body. A person who fulfills this need with emotional prayer and emotional study is nourishing their soul correctly. However, prayer and study without emotion will leave a vacuum that will force the soul to search for emotion anywhere, even in inappropriate places. I believe that we have an entire generation of Jews who are emotionally starving. I don't remember the last time I walked into a synagogue and saw someone crying. We're very emotionally and spiritually constipated. And people are not looking for that. They want to be able to experience something that's real. I remember when I was sitting at this Seder in India, there was a woman sitting next to me on the floor for our 8-hour Seder who was a single mom who came to live in northern India with her 2 children. And at one point I asked her while we were schmoozing, I said, how did you end up moving from California to here in India? And don't forget, this is a city that has running sewage going through the streets. It's not a beautiful place. She says to me that when she was in California, she was seeking something that was real, something that was spiritual, and she tried going to synagogues, and she told me wistfully that all she remembers experiencing in synagogues was this committee and that meeting and brotherhood and sisterhood and this meeting, and she said it was a big bureaucracy. And she said to me with tears in her eye, I was only looking for a place where I could feel reverent. She wanted to be able to go to a place where she could sit down and feel she was in the presence of God, and she felt that connection. And she told me she never experienced it in all the Jewish places she went. Not only do we have a need for passion and feeling, we have a tremendous need as human beings for meaning. Human beings need meaning. We don't find meaning in Judaism. In fact, the Zohar, the famous book of Jewish mysticism, the Zohar teaches that in the days and the years before the coming of the Messiah, Jews will experience the mitzvot of the Torah like a cow chewing on grass. How does a cow chew on grass? You all know that cows chew their cud. So the cow's going to chew the grass and then swallow it, and then it's going to regurgitate it from its stomach and chew it nachamol, right? What is that grass going to taste like after it's been chewed already, right, and sitting in the stomach for a few hours? It's not going to have much taste at all. And the Kabbalah teaches in the Zohar that before the coming of the Messiah, many, many Jewish people, that will be their experience of the Torah and the mitzvot. It'll be tasteless. You know, they tell a famous story that the Gera Rebbe once asked the Chafetz Chaim, right? We know that when the Jews came out of Egypt, they had a very special diet. They had manna coming from heaven, and they were able to eat this special food off the desert floor. And the rabbis teach that this manna would taste like whatever you were thinking about. If you were thinking about a chocolate milkshake, it tastes like a chocolate milkshake. You were thinking about sesame toasted tofu, it tasted like sesame toasted tofu. If you thought about broccoli, it tasted like broccoli. If you had some other vice, it tasted like that. And the Ger Rebbe asked the Chavetz Chaim, what would this taste like if you weren't thinking of anything? If you were eating the manna and didn't think of anything, what would it taste like? The Chavetz Chaim said he didn't know. The Ger Rebbe said, if you're not thinking about anything, hat nish ken tam. It doesn't have any taste. So we as Jews we have to have meaning. And when our Torah doesn't mean much to us, we haven't thought about what it means, we haven't been taught what it means, it doesn't have much taste. There's one other thing I believe that's very attractive to people in terms of the Eastern religions. Aside from being exotic, the spiritual paths of the East resonate with so many people because there are sophisticated disciplines that basically promise tremendous dividends in terms of the quality of our lives. There's a wonderful book written by a Jewish bubby named Sylvia Boorstein. She's a traditional Jew who teaches Buddhist meditation. Her book is called Funny, You Don't Look Buddhist. And she asked the question in the book, she tried to find out why are so many Jewish people interested in Buddhism. And she published here one of the answers she thinks is the best answer. She says, Buddhism is attractive to Jews because Jews are interested in it because it's a complete, mature, sophisticated spiritual path. It requires practice, not affiliation, and it's a spiritual path that promises transformation. When people study Buddhism, they're studying what they see is a system that can basically change who they are. It's a system where they can become, let's say, people with less anger, that have more inner peace. And they often don't see Judaism as a path for personal transformation. They see in Judaism holidays and a lot of rituals. They don't see how this stuff that we do as Jews connects to how we become bigger people, how we become changed people. And they see in Buddhism a very direct teaching and technology for personal transformation. One of the most depressing things I heard from Roger Kamenetz, and he actually writes about this in his book, The Jew and the Lotus. He talks about when he went to India, what happened in this book was that the Buddhists, the Tibetan Buddhists in India, are facing a tremendous problem. As I mentioned, they went to India in the 1960s. They left Tibet, and today there are hundreds of thousands of Tibetan Buddhists living in exile. They're not living in Tibet. And they're finding that it's not so easy to survive exile. Not so easy to survive being out of your land. And so the Cummings Foundation, which is a huge American foundation, decided that they're going to sponsor a number of meetings between the Dalai Lama and Jewish teachers and rabbis, because who else in the world are experts in surviving exile like the Jews? We've been at it for 2,000 years. So the idea was that Jewish people must have some insight, some technology for surviving exile. They decided we're going to have these meetings, and they sent about a dozen Jewish teachers and rabbis to India to meet with the Dalai Lama. Roger Kamenetz, who was a poet and a professor of English literature and a secular Jew, went to basically chronicle these meetings. And he published a book about these meetings called The Jew and the Lotus. One of the most depressing scenes in the book, and he spoke about this here when he came to Toronto, was the time when the Dalai Lama turned to all these rabbis, and they've been giving him all this Jewish wisdom about what we have as Jews. So he turns to the rabbis and he says to the rabbis, let me ask you a question. He asks them, what practices do you have as Jews to help you deal with afflictive emotions? What does Judaism have to help people deal with afflictive emotions? And Roger Kamenetz says that the rabbis looked at each other nervously, like, we don't know what in the world this guy is talking about. There was only one rabbi there who had any clue about what Judaism has to teach about things like dealing with jealousy and anger and patience. These are rabbis that probably spent almost all their time doing funerals and bar mitzvahs and circumcisions. And they had very little involvement with helping their congregants grow spiritually. So the Dalai Lama asked, what are the teachings in Judaism for dealing with, let's say, being impatient? They didn't know. They looked at each other embarrassed. There was an amazing film that I saw when I came to Toronto. I was very taken by the title of the film. It was called Doing Vipassana, Doing Time, Doing Vipassana. I mentioned before, Vipassana is the most popular form of Buddhist meditation here in the West. And I had to go see this film because it looked fascinating. So it was being shown here in Toronto. What was the premise of the film? It was about the largest prison in India. And it was not just the largest, but it was the most violent. It was a film about a prison where many of the prisoners were being held in prison, waiting trial for sometimes 10 years. Can you imagine? They weren't even convicted yet. And they're waiting for their trial 10 years. And this is the most hardened criminals in India. A real bunch of tough hombres. And the premise of the film, that the warden is leaving the prison, and they're getting a new warden. It's a woman, which is very unusual for India. And she has this incredible brainstorm. She says, you know what? I have all these people here. They're a captive audience. We're going to teach them meditation. So the film is called Doing Time, Doing Vipassana. And the Vipassana meditation program is basically a 10-day meditation retreat. The film shows these prisoners going through this retreat, coming out after the 10 days, and you could see on their faces and in terms of their body language, transformed people. People that the guards originally were terrified of them, they would kill their guards in 5 minutes, coming out crying and embracing and hugging and kissing the prison guards. The program there became so successful that they ended up actually bringing the program to North America. They brought it to Canada and the US to do this kind of program with prisoners in prison. So we see that the Eastern teachings are very, very powerful teachings in terms of transforming people. And I believe many Jews are attracted to this kind of transformative technology. So Roger Kamenetz is this secular Jew. He's in India. He's being exposed to all of this incredible Buddhist teaching. But he reacts very differently. He has a very different reaction to all of the Buddhism he's exposed to than many other Jews. Many other Jews are so attracted to it, they dive right in. Roger Kamenetz wrote the following. Through my encounters with Buddhism, he writes, I began asking different questions about Judaism. It led me to ask questions about Judaism. He wanted to know, how can Judaism make my life better? Can Judaism make my life better? How can I learn to bring blessing into my life? How can I live up to the Jewish ideal? How can I live up to the Jewish ideal of making everyday life sacred? I realized how I undervalued what was precious in my own tradition, especially prayer and study. I was also entirely ignorant of Jewish meditation, or the importance of kavanah, mindfulness, and intention in Jewish prayer and daily life. My contact with Tibetan Buddhists deepened my expectations of Judaism. My exposure to Buddhism deepened my expectations of Judaism. I've come to realize that the religion of my birth is not just an ethnicity or an identity. It is a way of life and a spiritual path with its own deep claims on my thoughts and feelings. And Roger Kamenetz ended up coming back to North America and going on a spiritual journey to try to discover the spiritual side of Judaism and writing a second book called Stalking Elijah. He's actually gone on to write several other books dealing with Jewish spiritual topics, one dealing with dreams and one comparing Franz Kafka to Rav Nachman of Breslov. So he's gone on a tremendous Jewish spiritual journey, that was ignited by his exposure to Tibetan Buddhists. I mentioned before that the cab ride from New Delhi to Dharamsala was 17 hours. And as you can imagine, no one could control themselves for 17 hours. So once in a while we had to have the driver pull over to the side of the road so we could use the so-called facilities. And I remember the first time we pulled over in the Punjab, we got back into the cab, and the cab did something very weird. In North America, many of the larger vehicles, when they back up, they will beep, right? When they're backing up, they go beep, 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 beep. This was a Jeep, actually. When it backed up, it played a song. It didn't beep. And I remember we're backing up to get onto the road, and out of the back of the Jeep, I hear da-da-da, da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da. There's no place like home. What's incredible is that so many of the things that people find attractive in Eastern religions are hiding in plain sight in Judaism. When I was in San Diego many, many years ago, I happened to see, I never saw it before, but I remember I was in this city on the west coast of the United States, and every single person I'm passing is reading the same book. They're all reading a book called The Celestine Prophecy by someone named Redfield. And I never saw the book before, but I said, this must be something interesting. Everybody's reading the same book. And so I ended up going to the bookstore and looking through the book. I decided I'm not going to buy it because it was too long for me to read. I wasn't that interested in the book. But I remember years later, they came out with a short version, like a Kitzur Celestine Prophecy. A very small little pocket book. And I bought that copy. Here's the outside jacket of the book, the Celestine Prophecy, a pocket guide to the 9 Insights by James Redfield. And I remember in my copy, you probably can't see it from where you're sitting, but in my copy, I went through each of the 9 spiritual insights of the Celestine Prophecy, a book that was sweeping the world, and I started writing down all of the Jewish parallels to each of the 9 spiritual insights of James Redfield's book. That none of these insights were things that were unique or unusual or foreign to Judaism. I basically found many, many, many Jewish parallels to every single thing that he was teaching. One of the most amazing Buddhist teachers in the world today is a very little tiny South Vietnamese Buddhist monk named Thich Nhat Hanh. Thich Nhat Hanh lives in Plum Village outside of Paris, and he's very prolific. He's written dozens and dozens of books. Wonderful books. One of his most famous books is called The Miracle of Mindfulness. And I picked up years ago one of his small books called Present Moment, Wonderful Moment. A small little book, Present Moment, Wonderful Moment. It's called Mindfulness Verses for Daily Living. They're called in his language, gathas, G-A-T-H-A-S. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it properly. But it's a book of these mindfulness verses. And I bought the book, and I'm reading through it. And it's interesting. There is a gatha for waking up in the morning, a gatha for going to the bathroom, a gatha for putting on your shoes, a gatha for eating breakfast. Every single thing you do in the morning, they have a gatha. I'm saying to myself, we've got the same exact list in the beginning of every Jewish prayer book, right? But the problem is that for many Jews, they don't see these morning blessings as moments to meditate, right? For him, these gathas are ways of centering the mind to really go through the experience of daily life in a mindful, present kind of way. And one of the things that we did at our Passover Seder, when we were with the 200 Israelis there, was to explain that we're not going to make a blessing before we drink the wine. We're now going to have a meditation before we drink the wine, because every blessing we say is an invocation to meditate. It's an invitation to think for a moment, what is this wine I'm about to drink? Where did it come from? Who should I be thankful to? And not to drink the wine or eat the food that we're going to eat mindlessly. How often we eat food like people eating potato chips. Like you're just going through the bag and we're not thinking, just shoving it down our throats. And so the bracha that we make, the blessing, is an opportunity to stop and think, what are we doing? We're going to be eating. Why is that significant? Why is it important? What can the act of eating mean? Among the Jewish mystics, the highest kind of spiritual activity is eating. The meal itself is the holiest activity. So Thich Nhat Hanh has his book of morning gathas, of these meditations that we can say as we go through the day. Right? Jews don't need to go to India, as one of the books I read, an amazing book by a woman who, her name is Pearl Epstein. She wrote a book called Pilgrimage. And she's going on this tremendous spiritual quest. And she had friends that ended up going to India and getting dysentery and dying. And she said that she doesn't know if she needs to go to India and get dysentery to find spirituality. We don't need to go to India to learn these morning meditations. Right? We have them in our tradition. I remember in 1998 when I came back from India, I went to a conference in New York on Jewish meditation. There were 1,000 Jewish people at this conference. And at one point, the organizers asked the people in the room, how many of you ever practiced a form of Eastern meditation? Every hand went up. Every person in the room had either done Vipassana or Zen or some other form of Eastern meditation. And then they asked the same people, how many people in the room ever did Jewish meditation? Not one hand went up. Because these people never knew that it existed. They had no clue that Judaism has a 3,000-year-old tradition, a meditative practice. My wife just finished teaching a 6 or 5 week class here at Shari Tefillah on Jewish meditation. But these are ancient Jewish teachings that somehow we're not aware of. And Jewish people somehow think they need to go elsewhere to find this kind of practice. One of the things that's very popular today in Buddhist culture, especially North American Buddhist culture, is people will go on retreat. Maybe once or twice a year, they'll save up some money, and for a weekend, they'll leave their normal environment, they'll leave their normal routine, they'll go away, and they'll be able to spend 24 hours, 48 hours, basically able to focus on their inner life. How many Jewish people that go on these Buddhist retreats don't realize that as Jews, we have a special spiritual retreat once a week? Once out of every 7 days, we leave our normal, routine, mundane lives, and we have a spiritual retreat where we retreat into an existence where basically we focus only on the spiritual. But people don't see Shabbat as a spiritual retreat. Many people see Shabbat as a day of torture. It's a day when I can't do this, and I can't do this, and I can't do this, rather than seeing it as a day where I'm liberated from all those routine things that I become slave to, and now I can basically spend 25 hours with myself, with my soul, quietly. I don't need all the noise that makes my life so busy. I don't have to fill every moment of my life with more music and more texting and more watching this and looking at that. So much of our life is encountering things that are external to us. Shabbat says, you know what? You spend this day just you, your soul, and God. I tell a beautiful story about this I've heard this story dozens of versions, but this Jewish person from shtetl town, either Krakow or somewhere like that, and he's very, very poor. And the person is going out of his mind because he can't support his family. He's a righteous person, a good person, but he had no mazel in terms of making money, and he was very desperate. One day he has a dream that if he travels all the way to Vienna, he's going to find a buried treasure. So he says to himself, what a crazy dream. I mean, it's a mishigas, a dream like that, it's nuts. But he has the same dream again, another time. He says, you know what, this can't be a coincidence. So he says, you know what, I'm desperate, and I've got to take my chances. He travels all the way to Vienna, and in the dream he saw that his treasure was awaiting him underneath this big bridge. The bridge was a bridge that sort of led to the palace of the king. He comes to the bridge, and he's very excited. He's going to try and find his buried treasure, but he sees the bridge there are guards all over the place. People don't want to let anyone just walk into the king's palace, so he sees guards all over the place, and he's very nervous. He can't start digging under the bridge now. And he sits on the side, he's looking, maybe the guards will fall asleep, and the guards are not falling asleep. The guards are very attentive, they're very alert. And he's sitting there, and he's waiting, and he's waiting, and he's waiting. Finally, one of the guards comes over to him and says, I've seen you. You're sitting here for about 4 or 5 days. You're looking very suspicious. What's going on with you? By this time, the person is very frustrated. The older man says, listen, I won't lie to you. I'm from a very far away place, and I had this dream twice that if I came to this city, I'd find this huge treasure buried under this bridge. And the guard laughs at him. He says, are you crazy? You listen to these stupid dreams? He said, I've had the same dream now for 3 years. And in my dream, there's an old Jewish guy named Itzik from Krakow. And this old Jewish guy, Itzik from Krakow, he's got in his kitchen an old stove, and under the stove is a huge treasure. So he's facing Itzik from Krakow. And Itzik from Krakow says to himself, uh-oh, I'm looking in the wrong place. And he goes all the way back home. He digs under the stove in his own kitchen, and he finds his buried treasure there. There's no reason for Jews to have to travel halfway around the world to learn about meditation, to learn about spiritual retreats, to learn technologies for becoming people that have more inner peace. The truth is that these are all deeply embedded within the core of Judaism. And I think that the challenge for us is to just help reveal these secrets that are buried, unfortunately, so deep that so many of our brothers and sisters really aren't aware of the tremendous treasure that lies buried in their own backyard.